Imagine looking at an old, quiet mission in the middle of a wide Texas landscape. Nothing about it tells you that it will soon become a shrine of rebellion, a symbol of stubborn courage, and a place where defeat becomes louder than victory. But that is what happened at the Alamo. A small group of Texan rebels walked into that worn-down mission, looked at its thin walls, its cracked church, its open courtyard, and still said, "We'll hold here." It was not logic speaking. It was pride, emotion, and a fierce sense of identity. And even though the mission was never meant to be a fortress, these men decided it would become one. Before the story continues, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. The battle did not start with heroism. It started with a stubborn choice that went against direct orders. The Texan leadership told the garrison to leave the Alamo. They knew it was too weak to defend. They knew Santa Anna's army was moving north with thousands of professional soldiers. They knew holding the old mission would stretch supplies and cut off escape. But the rebels inside the Alamo ignored all of this. They looked at the mission as a symbol. It stood in San Antonio, a key town that had changed hands several times. Leaving it felt like surrender. Staying felt like defiance. And sometimes defiance speaks louder than reason. Inside the Alamo were fewer than 200 men. They were not a uniform army. Some were experienced fighters. Some were frontiersmen who used rifles every day. Some were volunteers who barely understood the larger political struggle. Jim Bowie lay sick for most of the siege. Davy Crockett had only recently arrived from Tennessee, bringing a small group of riflemen. William B. Travis took command after tensions grew among the defenders, and he had to prove leadership in a place where courage mattered more than rank. These men were united only by one thing. They believed Texas should not fall back under the control of Santa Anna's centralist rule. When Santa Anna marched into Texas, he did not do it quietly. His army moved with speed and precision. They crossed harsh terrain, endured winter cold, and surprised the Texans with how quickly they reached San Antonio. Santa Anna did not intend to negotiate. His policy toward rebels was simple: crush them. He sent a red flag to the Alamo, meaning no quarter. It was a clear message that he did not plan to spare any defender. The men inside knew this. They read it as both a threat and a challenge. The defenders began strengthening the walls. They mounted cannons on platforms and patched weak areas with earth and timber. It was a desperate attempt to turn a religious mission into a military fort. You can imagine the tension as they worked. Every hammer strike echoed through the courtyard. Every shovel full of dirt felt like a race against time. They patched the north wall even though they knew it was too thin to withstand heavy artillery. They blocked gaps with rubble. They placed firing positions wherever they could. But deep down, they understood they were preparing for a fight they could not win. Once Santa Anna's army surrounded the mission, the siege began. The Mexicans placed artillery close enough to hit the walls with steady fire. Cannonballs slammed into the old stone. Dust fell from cracked corners. Sleep became almost impossible. The defenders took turns resting, but the sound of distant drums shouted orders, and sporadic gunfire kept them awake. Visibility from the walls showed fires, tents, and constant troop movement. Every day, more Mexican soldiers arrived. Every day, the noose tightened. Inside the Alamo, supplies were limited. The men rationed food, powder, and shot. They tried to conserve ammunition for the final assault because they knew it was coming. They cared for the sick, including Bowie, who could barely rise from his cot. There was no chance of relief. The Texan government was in chaos. Reinforcements were scattered and uncoordinated. Travis sent letters begging for help. He wrote about honor, sacrifice, and duty. These letters later became famous, but at the time, only a small number of volunteers reached the mission. Most reinforcements turned back once they heard how large Santa Anna's army was. The defenders faced harsh choices. They could have slipped out at night and abandoned the fight. Many knew the back routes into the hills, but they did not leave. Their refusal turned the siege into something larger than strategy. It became a statement. The men wanted to stand for Texas, even if it killed them. They wanted to slow Santa Anna long enough for the rest of the rebels to regroup. Holding the Alamo became a way to show that freedom required sacrifice. It was not a logical move, but it carried deep emotional weight. People rarely remember perfect strategy, but they always remember heroic last stands. Santa Anna grew impatient with the slow progress of the siege. He wanted a swift, crushing victory. He ordered his troops to prepare for a full assault on the mission. The Mexican soldiers formed columns and advanced before dawn on March 6, 1836. The cold morning air carried the sound of drums. Torches flickered as officers gave orders. The defenders inside the Alamo woke to the noise of boots, shouted commands, and the heavy thud of marching feet. The battle opened with a burst of gunfire. Cannon blasts hit the walls. Muskets cracked from both sides. The Mexican soldiers advanced under fire, climbing ladders and pushing toward the weak points. The defenders shot as fast as they could, loading rifles by touch and instinct. You can imagine the chaos. Smoke filling the courtyard, men shouting warnings, the recoil of rifles against shoulders, and the constant fear that someone would appear over the wall at any moment. The north wall collapsed first. It had been the weakest point since the beginning. Mexican troops poured through the breach. The defenders fell back toward the central buildings. Some fought from doorways, others fired from windows. Bowie's room was overrun, and he was killed where he lay. Crockett fought near the palisade, surrounded by smoke and noise. Travis died near the cannon he commanded. The last pockets of defense gathered in the chapel where the final shots echoed against stone walls. It was all over in a short span of time. The defenders had fought with everything they had, but they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. When the smoke cleared, the mission was silent. The Mexican soldiers moved through the courtyard. Stepping over bodies, Santa Anna ordered the remains of the defenders burned. He wanted the victory to send a message. He wanted to crush the Texan spirit, but instead, he created a legend. News of the fall of the Alamo spread across Texas with speed and fury. Instead of frightening the rebels, it gave them a rallying cry. "Remember the Alamo" became the words that fired their will to fight. It turned a doomed stand into the emotional fuel of a revolution. A battle that had no chance of success became the heart of Texan identity, proving that sometimes defeat shouts louder than victory. The Alamo looked impressive at first glance. Its high walls, arched doorways, and wide courtyard gave the illusion of strength. From a distance, it seemed defensible. Up close, it was anything but. The Texans' choice to occupy the mission was a dumb decision, driven more by pride and symbolism than logic. They did not select the strongest position. They chose a sprawling religious compound that was never intended to resist a determined military attack. Its walls were thick in some places, but patchy in others. Sections of the perimeter had large gaps, sections that could easily be breached once cannon fire began pounding. There were no strategically positioned bastions or reinforced gates. For a garrison of fewer than 200 men, these vulnerabilities made defense nearly impossible. The defenders understood the limits of their position, but leaving the mission would have felt like surrender. Pride outweighed prudence. Inside the Alamo, the courtyard was vast, but open. Soldiers could move from one section to another, but doing so often left them exposed. Every window, every door, every passage became a potential death trap the moment Mexican soldiers approached. Unlike a proper fort, where layers of walls and choke points could slow attackers, the Alamo offered only one main line of defense. The walls themselves, even then, some sections were low. Some sections had been eroded over time, and some had been damaged during prior skirmishes or by the lack of maintenance. The defenders tried to compensate by piling rubble against weak areas, stacking furniture, and digging shallow trenches where they could. It helped, but it was not nearly enough. The mission's structural shortcomings were always looming, a silent enemy that would outlast any heroism inside. Another critical issue was water. Unlike a traditional fort with a well or a cistern, the Alamo relied on external sources. Inside the walls, there was no consistent water supply for the defenders. In a siege scenario, this was disastrous. Men could endure hunger for a few days, but thirst is immediate and unforgiving. Any prolonged attack would quickly sap strength, impair shooting accuracy, and increase panic. The lack of water inside the Alamo was not just an inconvenience, it was a ticking time bomb. Even the small number of men inside understood this, and it added an invisible layer of stress that compounded the dangers of their physical vulnerability. The large, sprawling footprint of the mission was also a problem. A larger area might seem like an advantage because it allows more troops to maneuver, but for fewer than 200 defenders, it was a curse. The men had to spread themselves thin to cover the walls, leaving each section vulnerable to concentrated attacks. Mexican forces, numbering several thousand, could focus on one section at a time, overwhelming defenders with sheer numbers. Every shift in troop placement stretched the garrison further, creating gaps and weaknesses. The more territory the Texans tried to control, the thinner their line became. In a proper fort, defenders could concentrate where needed. In the Alamo, they had no such luxury. It was a fortress that forced them to divide and weaken themselves. The terrain outside the Alamo also worked against the defenders. The compound was not isolated on high ground or surrounded by natural barriers. Open fields, low walls, and flat approaches made it easy for Mexican artillery to target walls and gates. Enemy troops could advance without significant obstacles until they reached the mission's perimeter. The lack of natural defensive features turned every approach into a death march. The Texans could set traps, fire from windows, or create barricades, but the geography worked entirely in favor of the attackers. Unlike European or classical forts designed to exploit hills, rivers, or cliffs, the Alamo stood exposed, a prize waiting for the hammer of overwhelming force. Inside, the defenders tried to make the most of what they had. Cannons were mounted wherever the walls allowed. Improvised firing positions were created in doorways and windows. Men rotated to keep the walls manned, and officers coordinated what they could from limited observation points. Despite this, the gaps in the walls and the openness of the courtyard constantly forced them to choose which section to defend and which to leave weaker. Every choice was a gamble, every deployment a risk. The Alamo's size was not an advantage. It was a constant strategic dilemma that worked to the attackers' favor. Leadership decisions amplified these structural weaknesses. Travis, Bowie, and Crockett could inspire courage, but they could not turn weak walls into strong ones. Orders could move men into position, but even the most disciplined soldier could only do so much against a physical reality that limited their defensive potential. The mission was an unsuited stronghold, and no amount of bravery or determination could fully compensate. Each cannonball that hit a thin section of the wall, each volley that struck a door, reminded the defenders of their precarious position. They were literally holding their ground on hope and courage, not on sound military architecture. The Alamo's lack of internal defensive depth made counterattacks nearly impossible. A proper fort often has multiple lines of defense, allowing a garrison to fall back, regroup, and strike again. At the Alamo, there was no such safety net. If attackers breached one section, the defenders had nowhere to regroup. The inner buildings were themselves weak and could be quickly overrun. Every portion of the mission depended entirely on the initial line of walls. Once broken, the compound would collapse from within, leaving every man exposed. This would happen exactly as the Mexican forces planned. The architecture ensured that heroism could delay, but not prevent, the inevitable. Another overlooked issue was the lack of storage for supplies. Barracks and rooms inside the mission were converted into makeshift powder magazines, food storage, and sleeping quarters. The overcrowding created chaos and risk. Ammunition had to be rationed because there was nowhere to safely store the hundreds of rounds needed for sustained defense. Food and water were minimal, creating stress and fatigue among the men. Over days of siege, this lack of supplies would degrade their ability to fight. A fortress without secure storage is a fortress doomed to crumble under pressure. The defenders' choice of the Alamo was also symbolic. They were not just holding a place, they were trying to hold Texas itself in miniature. They wanted to make a statement, not just survive tactically. Pride over practical, defensive design motivated them. Every man inside the walls understood this. They were willing to face the consequences of the mission as flaws because abandoning it would feel like betraying the cause. History remembers bravery, but the Alamo is a cautionary tale about ignoring practical realities for symbolic victories. The symbolism carried them forward, but it did not strengthen the walls, the gates, or the water supply. By the time the Mexican army arrived in full force, the limitations of the Alamo were undeniable. Every structural weakness, every exposed approach, every internal shortage became deadly. The defenders had to face a relentless bombardment with walls that could not fully absorb artillery fire. The open courtyard offered no protection against massed infantry attacks. Every tactical choice was constrained by the compound's poor design. Even the best snipers, the most agile riflemen, and the most courageous soldiers could only do so much. The physical reality of the Alamo guaranteed that only a few hours could delay the inevitable final assault. The lesson is clear. Choosing the Alamo was as much a moral statement as it was a military error. The compound's sprawling design, weak walls, lack of water, poor internal storage, and exposed terrain all contributed to the garrison's vulnerability. They were not defeated because they lacked courage. They were defeated because they occupied a place unsuited for defense against an overwhelming force. Strategy collided with pride, and the architecture itself became the enemy. The defenders' bravery could only slow what the walls could not hold. It was a fortress that was not a fort, and it would exact the ultimate price. Santa Anna approached the Alamo with absolute confidence. He had a massive army, numbering several thousand, while the Texan defenders barely exceeded 180 men. From his perspective, victory should have been swift, a matter of overwhelming force. But Santa Anna's immense ego turned what could have been a measured operation into a high-risk, brutal siege. He refused to negotiate, refused to consider surrender terms, and demanded the complete subjugation of the rebels. The very idea that a small band of men could defy him personally was intolerable. Every decision he made was filtered through the lens of personal pride, which would ultimately shape the cost and conduct of the battle. From the outset, Santa Anna insisted on a strategy that prioritized speed and psychological domination over caution or efficiency. He wanted to crush the rebellion before it could inspire other uprisings across Texas. His plan was straightforward in theory: lay siege to the Alamo, cut off supplies, and force the defenders to surrender. But the implementation reflected his personal arrogance rather than military prudence. He underestimated the defenders' determination and overestimated the capacity of his forces to execute a flawless assault on a poorly structured but fiercely defended position. The human element, the unpredictability of determined resistance, was largely ignored. Santa Anna's ego dictated that the rebels could not be allowed to leave alive, that surrender was not an option, and that any delay would reflect poorly on him. This ego-driven approach translated into costly tactical decisions. Mexican forces attempted a series of frontal assaults against the mission's walls, advancing over open ground that offered no cover. Despite their numbers, these attacks were blunted repeatedly by Texan riflemen and improvised defensive positions along the walls. Every attempt to storm the mission resulted in casualties far higher than necessary. Over 600 Mexican soldiers were killed or wounded in the process, a staggering figure, when considering the mission's defenders numbered only a fraction of the attackers. Santa Anna's refusal to adopt alternative tactics or to patiently starve the defenders out turned a potentially low-cost operation into a deadly meat grinder for his own army. Santa Anna also made the dumb decision of underestimating the morale and ingenuity of the Texan defenders. The Alamo's garrison, though small, had positioned sharpshooters on walls and rooftops, used windows as firing slits, and rigged makeshift barricades to delay the enemy. Every advance by Mexican troops was met with coordinated volleys of gunfire, precise and deadly despite the overwhelming numerical disadvantage. Santa Anna's insistence on immediate assaults ignored the cumulative effect of these defensive tactics. His soldiers were funneled into kill zones created by the defenders' understanding of the mission's layout. The more his ego demanded a swift conclusion, the more his men paid the price with every attack. The terrain surrounding the Alamo amplified the cost of Santa Anna's ego-driven siege. Open fields, low stone walls, and the sparsely vegetated approaches gave defenders perfect lines of sight. Every column of Mexican troops advancing across these fields became an easy target for Texan riflemen. The flat, unobstructed terrain provided no cover, and the lack of alternate approaches forced attackers into predictable routes. A more flexible commander might have used encirclement, trenching, or diversionary attacks to reduce casualties. Santa Anna, however, preferred the spectacle of a direct assault, believing that sheer weight of numbers and the inevitability of victory would compensate for exposed soldiers. It did not. Santa Anna's psychological approach to the siege further worsened the situation. He demanded unconditional surrender, leaving no room for negotiation or compromise. He believed that granting quarter would undermine his authority and embolden resistance elsewhere. This rigid demand ensured that the defenders had no incentive to yield. For Texan morale, it was galvanizing. Knowing that surrender was not an option, every man inside the Alamo fought with desperate determination. Santa Anna's desire to assert personal dominance turned a military operation into a moral contest. giving the defenders a clear existential reason to resist and amplifying their defensive effectiveness. The use of artillery under Santa Anna's command reflected the same ego-driven impatience. Heavy cannon were brought forward to breach the walls, but the accuracy and placement were inconsistent. The Mexican forces fired on the mission, not with strategic precision, but with overwhelming volume, attempting to intimidate and overpower. Walls were pounded, but weak points were often missed, and breaches were incomplete. This reliance on brute force, rather than tactical finesse, increased the exposure of the soldiers manning the artillery, leaving them vulnerable to sharpshooters on the walls. Every misfire or poorly targeted barrage was a reflection of leadership that valued speed and intimidation over careful planning. Frontal assaults also played into the defenders' hands. The combination of exposed open ground, scattered Texan riflemen, and makeshift fortifications turned each attack into a slaughter. Horses and infantry alike were easy targets. The defenders targeted officers first, understanding that killing leaders would sow confusion among attacking units. Yet Santa Anna persisted, motivated by personal pride and the desire to complete the conquest without delay. His insistence on demonstrating power cost him heavily, as the attackers suffered repeated bloody setbacks that could have been avoided with patience, siege tactics, or more indirect methods. Beyond immediate tactical consequences, Santa Anna's ego-driven strategy had strategic implications. Each high-casualty assault slowed his army's momentum, giving time for reinforcements to arrive elsewhere in Texas and for news of the Alamo's defense to inspire resistance. The psychological effect of the Texan stand was magnified by his insistence on a no-quarter policy and aggressive frontal attacks. Instead of crushing the rebellion quickly, Santa Anna created a symbol of resistance whose impact resonated far beyond the walls of the mission. The Alamo's defenders became martyrs, and the narrative of heroic sacrifice fueled the Texan Revolution, proving that ego and brutality do not always translate into effective strategy. Santa Anna's behavior during the siege also demonstrated a misunderstanding of human endurance. The defenders, though few, were highly motivated and familiar with the terrain. They worked in shifts, rotated positions, and conserved ammunition carefully. His insistence on rapid, repeated assaults failed to account for their defensive endurance. Every failed attack drained Mexican morale, depleted energy, and caused disorganization within his ranks. An intelligent commander would have adapted to these conditions, perhaps by tightening the siege, cutting off supplies, or employing diversionary tactics. Santa Anna, however, allowed personal pride to dictate operations, which ultimately magnified casualties unnecessarily and prolonged the siege. Even the timing of the final assault reflected ego-driven impatience. Historical accounts suggest that Santa Anna could have waited, completed careful reconnaissance, and prepared a coordinated attack at lower cost. Instead, he launched a direct, sweeping offensive, expecting his overwhelming numbers to guarantee immediate success. The defenders, already fatigued from constant vigilance, were prepared for this moment. The attack resulted in intense close-quarters combat, further inflating Mexican losses. Santa Anna's desire for a rapid, decisive victory over a small force exemplified how arrogance can turn numerical superiority into a liability. Santa Anna's siege strategy offers a larger lesson in leadership and the limits of brute force. Authority and ego cannot replace careful planning, intelligence, and respect for the opponent. Even a vastly superior force can suffer disproportionately when leadership decisions prioritize personal pride over tactical logic. The Alamo siege demonstrates that underestimating a motivated, adaptive opponent can turn confidence into catastrophe. Every casualty inflicted was paid for by hubris, proving that personal ego can become a strategic liability in war, no matter the size of the army. In the end, Santa Anna's approach to the Alamo combined overwhelming force with strategic impatience. His insistence on unconditional surrender, direct assaults across exposed terrain, and reliance on numerical superiority without tactical adaptation ensured that every hour of combat came at a high human cost. Over 600 Mexican soldiers died or were wounded in the process, an extraordinary number given the small size of the Texan garrison. His personal desire for quick triumph and absolute dominance transformed what could have been a controlled siege into a deadly, ego-driven assault that burned his army physically and morally, while simultaneously creating heroes. Out of the defenders, he sought to annihilate. The pre-dawn hours of March 6, 1836, marked the beginning of the Alamo's final, unforgiving assault. Santa Anna, satisfied that his preparations were complete, gave the order to advance. The Mexican army moved in coordinated waves, climbing ladders, pushing through gaps in the mission walls, and attempting to overwhelm the defenders by sheer weight of numbers. The defenders, fewer than 200 men in total, faced thousands of enemy soldiers armed with bayonets, muskets, and sabers. Despite the disparity, every Texan fought with a determination born of desperation, honor, and the knowledge that surrender would mean certain death. This was not simply a battle. It was the culmination of a siege fueled by ego, stubbornness, and the clash of national and personal pride. As the first waves of Mexican troops reached the walls, the Texans unleashed a relentless storm of fire. Their rifles and pistols, though limited in supply, found deadly marks. Every ladder that touched the parapets became a focal point of resistance. Texan sharpshooters targeted officers and soldiers attempting to climb, throwing grenades and overturning ladders wherever possible. The close quarters of the assault created a deadly bottleneck. Mexican soldiers, trained for conventional open-field engagements, found themselves trapped in confined spaces, forced to fight hand-to-hand with men who had nothing to lose. Each failed advance cost dozens of lives, while morale among the defenders, though waning, remained resolute. The Mexican army, despite superior numbers, was ill-prepared for the defenders' tenacity and knowledge of the mission layout. The Texan garrison had fortified key choke points, barricading doors and reinforcing weak sections of wall. The attackers, expecting a swift breach, were met with concentrated resistance at multiple locations simultaneously. The defenders leveraged every inch of terrain, firing from windows, using beams and doors as improvised weapons, and collapsing staircases to delay pursuit. For every soldier who made it inside, there was immediate close-quarters combat with men fighting for their lives. Santa Anna's insistence on a rapid assault meant that reinforcements were thrown in without reconnaissance, leading to confusion and friendly fire incidents that compounded Mexican losses. The psychological intensity of the assault cannot be overstated. The Texan defenders, including figures like Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett, embodied the victory or death ethos. Bowie, known for his legendary fighting skill, reportedly engaged multiple enemies simultaneously, using his iconic knife to deadly effect in the corridors of the mission. Crockett and others manned the long rifles, focusing on high-value targets and creating the illusion that more defenders were present than reality suggested. Their resistance slowed the Mexican advance and inflicted far more casualties than expected. Santa Anna's desire for a total annihilation of the garrison made him underestimate the cumulative impact of a small but highly motivated force fighting in a confined, fortified space. As the assault progressed, the Mexican forces gradually penetrated the mission's inner courtyards. The defenders were systematically pushed back, their numbers dwindling with each engagement. Hand-to-hand combat became the norm. Soldiers wielded bayonets, sabers, and even improvised weapons. The Texans, aware that retreat was impossible, fought to the last man. Their defensive positions forced the attackers into deadly choke points, turning the mission's layout against the overwhelming numerical advantage of the Mexican army. Each room and hallway became a mini-battle, with the casualties mounting on both sides. The Texan resolve, however, was unyielding, rooted in a mix of desperation, patriotism, and the knowledge that their stand would echo far beyond the mission's walls. Santa Anna, observing the battle, demanded that his men show no mercy. His prior orders for no quarter meant that surrendering defenders were executed immediately. This policy, while intended to intimidate and demoralize, instead fueled the defenders' determination. They understood that yielding was not an option, which made them fight with extraordinary courage and ingenuity. Mexican soldiers reported that even when Texan defenders were outnumbered and outflanked, they continued to resist fiercely, causing confusion and slowing the army's advance. The mission, despite being a former religious compound rather than a true fort, became a deadly fortress because of the defenders' resolve and the attackers' underestimation of human willpower. The final moments of the Alamo saw some of the fiercest close-quarters combat of the entire Texan Revolution. The defenders, cornered in courtyards and buildings, fought in isolated pockets. Every wall, doorway, and hallway was contested. Mexican soldiers, attempting to clear rooms, faced concentrated fire at short range. The chaos of the battle led to high casualties for the attackers, as well as instances of soldiers becoming trapped or disoriented in the maze of the mission. The defenders' intimate knowledge of the layout turned a small number of men into a highly effective force multiplier, delaying Santa Anna's complete control and demonstrating the power of resolve, preparation, and tactical ingenuity under extreme pressure. By mid-morning, the mission was effectively overrun. The majority of Texan defenders had been killed in combat. Historical accounts suggest that only a handful survived initial breaches, and those were executed according to Santa Anna's orders. The Mexican army's victory, while complete, came at a cost that was far higher than necessary. Hundreds of Mexican soldiers were dead or wounded, a testament to the stubborn resistance of a vastly outnumbered force. The Alamo's defense, though ending in defeat, became a symbol of courage and sacrifice, immortalizing the defenders' actions and highlighting the dangers of ego-driven command and the underestimation of determined opposition. The fall of the Alamo demonstrated the lethal combination of a stubborn, heroic defense and the consequences of leadership. Blinded by personal pride, Santa Anna's insistence on a direct, overwhelming assault and his no-quarter policy inflicted unnecessary casualties on his own forces. The defenders' refusal to yield transformed what was a doomed military position into a legendary act of resistance. The siege and final assault exemplify how human courage, intimate knowledge of terrain, and moral resolve can offset numerical and material superiority in battle. Even after the battle, the effects of Santa Anna's decisions were evident. The heroism of the Texan defenders became a rallying cry across Texas, inspiring recruits to join the revolution and fueling the determination to continue fighting against Mexican forces. The narrative of sacrifice at the Alamo spread quickly, demonstrating that tactical victory does not always translate into strategic advantage. Santa Anna had won the battle, but his ego-driven decisions created a symbol that would outlive the immediate outcome, proving that the psychological and cultural impact of a military action can outweigh the battlefield results. The final, unforgiving assault of the Alamo remains a prime example of the deadly consequences of combining overwhelming force with impatience and rigid insistence on personal dominance. Every wave of Mexican troops was funneled into prepared defenses, every breach contested fiercely, and every miscalculation magnified by the defenders' determination. The casualty numbers reflect not only the tenacity of the Texans, but also the predictable costs of underestimating an opponent and allowing ego to dictate strategy. In military terms, the battle was a tactical victory for Santa Anna. In historical and cultural terms, it became a defining moment for Texan identity and revolutionary resolve. The Battle of the Alamo's Pre-Dawn Assault on March 6, 1836, is therefore more than a story of loss. It is a story of human courage against overwhelming odds, the deadly interplay of ego-driven command, and the profound consequences of underestimating both terrain and opponent. The final hours inside the mission, filled with blood, chaos, and defiance, encapsulate the tragic brilliance of the defenders' resistance and the preventable cost of mismanaged leadership, offering lessons in both valor and the limits of hubris. The Alamo, while a complete military disaster for the Texan defenders, unexpectedly became a political and psychological turning point for the revolution. The defenders' deaths were not just a tragic loss, they were transformed into a symbol of resistance, courage, and the stakes of independence. The brutality of the Mexican victory shocked the Texan population and created an intense wave of outrage and unity. Santa Anna's decision to grant no quarter, executing nearly every man in the fort rather than taking prisoners, played directly into the hands of the revolutionaries, fueling their resolve rather than breaking it. The massacre at the Alamo became a stark example of both the human cost of rebellion and the moral legitimacy of the Texan cause. The rallying cry, "Remember the Alamo," quickly spread across Texas. It was repeated in towns, plantations, and military camps, becoming a unifying slogan that reminded every Texan of the sacrifice of their compatriots. Unlike simple propaganda, this slogan carried the weight of real blood, real loss, and undeniable heroism. Every recruit joining Sam Houston's army could visualize the determination of Bowie Crockett and the other defenders, understanding that failure. at the Alamo was not only a lesson in courage, but also a warning of what was at stake if they did not continue the fight. In a sense, the defeat itself became a strategic tool, galvanizing morale and ensuring that the Texan resistance did not falter despite facing a more numerous and experienced Mexican army. The political impact of the Alamo extended beyond the borders of Texas. Reports of the massacre reached the United States and stirred public opinion in favor of the Texan cause. Letters, newspaper articles, and eyewitness accounts described the heroism of the defenders and the mercilessness of Santa Anna. These accounts framed the Alamo as a moral struggle against tyranny, portraying the Texan volunteers as brave individuals standing up for freedom against an oppressive regime. The battle, though lost on the field, became a powerful piece of narrative propaganda that shaped the larger political discourse and positioned the Texan rebels as righteous actors, fighting for self-determination. Sam Houston, understanding the political and psychological significance of the Alamo, used the massacre strategically. He organized the Texan forces with the memory of the fallen defenders as both a motivational tool and a reminder of the stakes involved. Houston avoided premature engagement with the Mexican army, instead choosing to strengthen his forces, train volunteers, and plan his campaigns carefully. The sacrifice at the Alamo served as a constant reminder to his army that hesitation could lead to the same fate. This disciplined approach, rooted in the political and emotional momentum generated by the Alamo, directly contributed to the eventual decisive victory at the Battle of San Jacinto, where Houston's forces captured Santa Anna and secured Texan independence. The human story of the Alamo also played a role in shaping Texan identity. The defenders, who ranged from experienced frontiersmen to idealistic volunteers, became archetypes of courage, resistance, and the willingness to sacrifice for a larger cause. The battle emphasized personal honor, loyalty, and the willingness to face overwhelming odds, traits that were celebrated and mythologized in Texan culture. Monuments, literature, and oral histories preserved the memory of the defenders, ensuring that the Alamo would not be forgotten as a mere military failure, but as a defining moment in the narrative of Texan resilience and determination. The psychological impact on the Mexican side was also significant, though in a different manner. Santa Anna's insistence on total annihilation and his underestimation of the political ramifications of such brutality ultimately undermined his position. The large-scale execution of Texan defenders, while eliminating immediate resistance, inflamed the broader population and galvanized the enemy's morale. Mexican forces faced an enemy that was not only motivated by survival, but also driven by outrage and the moral imperative to avenge fallen comrades. This dynamic transformed what should have been a straightforward tactical victory into a long-term strategic challenge, demonstrating how political consequences can emerge from battlefield decisions. The Alamo also highlighted the importance of narrative in warfare. While military historians often analyze battles in terms of strategy, troop movements, and material outcomes, the Alamo's aftermath shows that perception and symbolism can outweigh immediate tactical results. The battle was a defeat in practical terms, but the cultural and political power generated by the defenders' courage created a momentum that ultimately contributed to Texan success. It reinforced the idea that heroism, sacrifice, and the moral framing of conflict can transform local events into pivotal historical moments with far-reaching consequences. Furthermore, the battle exemplified the interplay between tactical decision-making and broader political outcomes. The Texan defenders' decision to stay and fight, though militarily unwise, allowed them to create a narrative of martyrdom and resistance that resonated far beyond the walls of the Alamo. Santa Anna's tactical choice to execute the defenders, driven by personal ego and a desire to intimidate, inadvertently amplified the Texan cause. In essence, the political consequences of the battle were the inverse of its military outcome, demonstrating the complex relationship between immediate action and long-term strategic effects. In practical terms, the Alamo's aftermath reshaped the Texan military approach. Sam Houston capitalized on the psychological momentum created by the defenders' deaths. He trained his forces, selected advantageous terrain, and executed a surprise attack at the Battle of San Jacinto with precision. The energy and determination ignited by the Alamo carried the morale of his army, enabling a small, well-prepared force to defeat a larger, more established army. The Alamo's legacy, therefore, was not just symbolic, but operational, affecting the conduct and success of subsequent military campaigns that secured independence. Finally, the Alamo endures as a testament to the complex nature of victory and defeat. While the immediate military result was catastrophic for the defenders, the political, cultural, and psychological consequences ensured that the battle became a turning point in the Texan Revolution. It demonstrates how courage, narrative, and moral legitimacy can transform tactical loss into strategic advantage. The sacrifice of fewer than 200 men created a symbol that mobilized thousands, shaping the course of history. The Alamo story serves as a reminder that human will, perception, and resilience are as crucial to political outcomes as armies and weaponry, and that sometimes the greatest victories emerge from the ashes of apparent defeat. The Battle of the Alamo, culminating in the sacrifice of its defenders and the brutal execution carried out by Santa Anna's forces, stands as a powerful lesson in the interplay between battlefield action and political consequence. The massacre, while a military loss, forged an emotional and cultural rallying point that directly influenced the successful fight for Texan independence. Remember, the Alamo became more than a slogan. It became a strategy, uniting a population, motivating an army, and ensuring that the blood spilled in San Antonio contributed directly to the creation of a new republic. The Alamo's enduring legacy proves that, in history, as in war, sometimes the greatest victories are born from the courage to resist, even in the face of certain defeat. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe to The Dumb Historian for more deep dives into history's most fascinating and consequential events.